Hey, what's up, y'all? So, the Ruthless Aggression documentary, episode 5, is in the books, and this is the brand extension episode. It starts with Vince McMahon consistently talking about having to take a half step back. Essentially, they have to sort of hurt their business in order for the business to grow in the future. And what he meant by this was doing the brand split was taking a step back and, cutting revenue and cutting TV ratings and stuff like that to at the time, in the hopes that you can make more stars and grow the product later. And Paul Heyman says, hey, we got what we got now. What is our main event for in 18 months? And they had this abundance of young talent, all these new guys that they had signed from WCW and ECW. And these guys needed time to grow and develop. And they couldn't do that with one brand. So they split the brands. They split the WWE into two separate brands. So the purpose of the brand split was to make new stars. That was the main goal of the brand split. But the secondary goal was to manufacture competition within the company. And because Paul Heyman was running SmackDown, he was able to actually do that. So Paul Heyman being very competitive would, needle and try to do different things. Like, he was making trades and all this sort of things. But what they really wanted to do was not just build new stars and build competition within the brands, but they also wanted to give each brand their own individual identity. So that means each brand had to have their own writing staff. And so Brian Gerwitz was the head of creative for Raw. Paul Heyman was the head of creative for SmackDown. And they were the guys driving the creative portion of the brands. And SmackDown became sort of the wrestling show. It was the show where, you would have a good 15-minute match. Raw was the entertainment show. It was the larger than life personalities. It was that sort of thing. And they talked about, fans didn't really like it. Becky Lynch showed up and, she popped up in the documentary and she said that in Ireland she didn't have cable. So she could only watch SmackDown. So she didn't like the brand split. And I was kind of the same way when I was a kid, even though I was like 20 at the time. But I didn't have cable. So I could only watch SmackDown. So, I didn't. Thankfully, I wasn't missing anything because, again, I was so pissed off by the reign of terror. I was not interested in Raw anyway. But I couldn't watch Raw. So, it didn't make me much of a deal. But Heyman brought a sort of level of realness to this thing, as far as he was negotiating and trying to make trades and all those sorts of things. And he talked a lot about the inequality between the brands. Essentially, that the vision that SmackDown was the B show. And this idea continues to year of our Lord 2020, where SmackDown is still considered the B show, even though they get higher ratings than Raw. So even back then, when SmackDowns were getting higher ratings than Raw, it still seemed like SmackDown was the big show because because Vince McMahon only really cares about Raw. And this was the perspective. And they say, well, even if Vince McMahon says otherwise, you can see it in his actions and the way that he does things, that he really cares about Raw more than SmackDown. And they didn't go into this, and so this is just me talking, but you could see what they were doing with Raw, and you could tell that was true. For instance, when SmackDown was really grooving, they started doing stuff like they would bring in Goldberg and put him on Raw. Even though The Rock was on SmackDown, they had The Rock on Raw. They brought back Stone Cold Steve Austin on Raw. They brought back Shawn Michaels on Raw. They didn't give SmackDown anything. SmackDown had like Hulk Hogan and Undertaker, and Hogan was pretty much on his way out during those early years of the brand split. They didn't really give SmackDown much of anything. So SmackDown had to make their own stars. And that became like SmackDown's focus, was making their own stars. And, and their identity was, being the wrestling show. And Paul Heyman, was kind of the mastermind. They didn't go into the SmackDown 6, which is really sad, but they kind of alluded to it. They mentioned most of those guys, the Guerreros, Chavo and Eddie, Ed Ray, Edge, who else was it? I think Benoit and Angle. And that's probably why they didn't bring it up, because Benoit was one of those guys. But they mentioned most of them by name. They didn't mention Chris Benoit at all, though. But it was Berengowitz was talking about essentially that it was easy to write SmackDown because Paul would just give guys matches and say go 3 segments, and that was easy for him to write the show, while he had to write talking segments and all these sorts of things because he had more personalities, and they were selling the entertainment side. So you had a lot of, and this, nothing sort of epitomized this more than the trade that they talked about. They talked about one particular trade that I thought was really interesting, and the trade was Chris Jericho, Lance Storm, and Christian from SmackDown to be moved to Raw in exchange for just Eddie Guerrero. And Paul Heyman initiated that trade. He's talking about how people thought he was crazy because he was getting rid of Chris Jericho and Christian and all these guys, but they didn't know what they had with Eddie Guerrero. And if you know, like I know, that Paul Heyman worked with Eddie Guerrero in ECW, Paul Heyman knows Eddie Guerrero, right? And in a couple of years, maybe 2 years after this trade, Eddie was one of the biggest stars in the company, because even though Paul was gone at this point, I think. So, it became a Paul being able to be sneaky and, cut the legs out from under Raw a little bit. And SmackDown, was doing better on TV. Even though I think right now in 2020, SmackDown does better on TV than Raw too. But back then, the perception as far as the inequality between brands is that Vince McMahon didn't care about SmackDown. He only cared about Raw. So he would do little things to stick it to SmackDown a little bit. And Paul would fight back. He would have his announcers attack, the Raw announcers and all of the obnoxious shit Taz would say and do. Because Taz was really obnoxious at the time. I mean, my God, he was God fucking awful. Especially like one Royal Rumble. I forget which year it was. I think it was 2005. I mean, fucking Taz was God fucking awful. I mean, he was just terrible as being the biased SmackDown announcer. He was fucking terrible. He was hard to listen to. But in any event, they talked, but you could see like they were doing stuff like bringing in bigger stars on Raw. Like they brought in Eric Bischoff. They brought in Eric Bischoff for Raw. Goldberg. They brought The Rock in, and they brought Shawn Michaels back, and Kevin Nash, and they brought him back. He was working on Raw, and these sorts of things, and they were kind of just loading up star power on Raw, while SmackDown had to make their own stars. And this was honestly ended up being for the best, because for the next almost 10 goddamn years, whenever SmackDown would make a star, Raw would take them. So you would see and because the brands had their individual identities, you will often see guys flourish on SmackDown and get buried on Raw. There's like 4 guys I can think of off the top of my head, like Jack Swagger, MVP, Mr. Kennedy, and there was somebody else that was right on the tip of my goddamn tongue, but I forget who it is. It'll come to me eventually. But those 3 guys, Jack Swagger, Mr. Kennedy, MVP, Carlito was the other one, that when they were on SmackDown, they were perfectly fine. They seemed to be steadily moving up the card, and then they would get shifted to Raw, and they would get stuck in that meat grinder on Raw. Even if they had a good personality, like MVP had a big personality, and Carlito had a big personality, and Mr. Kennedy had a big personality, but they couldn't get over on Raw because a lot of the tenured guys on Raw were not as friendly and not as fluid as the tenured guys on SmackDown. Like the tenured guys on SmackDown were like Undertaker, while the guys on Raw would be like HBK and Triple H. So like if like just the personalities there, it's a lot different. And Mr. Kennedy talked about this, right? Like he talked about the little things that he would do in his matches, because he talked about this in a shoot interview and JR on JR's podcast, that when they did the show about Mr. Kennedy, they talked about this, that Undertaker was willing to work with Ken and actually do more with him, but on Raw, the same things that he would do on SmackDown he was getting grilled for. They were saying it was the shits. They didn't want to be bothered with it. And there's a lot more politics on Raw. And we see that even today, where you see like only John Cena that I can think of off the top of my head went from SmackDown to Raw and remained the top guy like he was on SmackDown. Like, even like JBL, when JBL moved to Raw, like they pretty much killed him. Like they just don't care about, when SmackDown makes a star, Raw takes them and buries them, which is kind of what they started doing in NXT, right? So it's not like it was completely out of the blue. But they also talked a lot about they didn't talk a lot about it, but the tours. So SmackDown would have their tour. They would also have their own pay-per-views. Raw would have their own tours. They would have their own pay-per-views, but they would, of course, get together for SummerSlam and WrestleMania and all that stuff. So that was interesting, and they talked a lot. They spent about the last 15 minutes talking about the stars that were made, and there's two sort of groups of stars that were made during the brand extension. One were the guys who had been on the roster for a long time, but they didn't have time to develop, and they were now they were given opportunities to develop, and they were getting more looks. This would be Bradshaw, Eddie Guerrero, and Edge. So, Edge had been on the roster since 1998, and he couldn't get anywhere. Like he had won the King of the Ring, and, he had, won the Intercontinental Championship and done some stuff, but it wasn't until the brand extension that he was actually able to go out there and show who he was, and show what he can do. And same thing with Bradshaw. Like, it wasn't until he was always sort of the guy that JBL became, but he didn't have an opportunity to show it because there was always bigger stars on the brand than him. So now that he was on SmackDown, he could show more of his personality, and of course Eddie Guerrero would be the exact same way. And then the second type of star would be the new star, the John Cena's, the Randy Ortons, and the Batistas, guys who weren't stars before, who had never worked anywhere before, and those guys who would come up. And they didn't really get too far into it. Like, they kind of seemed to have put a lid on it at like 2005. But like I said, there were guys earlier where you talk about MVP and Mr. Kennedy and Carlito and Shelton Benjamin. When Shelton Benjamin moved to Raw, for somehow he became so much better when he was a solo act. They didn't mention that, but it just occurred to me, like, he's one of the only guys I've seen that go from SmackDown to Raw and become better, because we was able to see the true nature of Shelton Benjamin as an act when he was on SmackDown. When he was on Raw as a solo act over on SmackDown. But they also talked about Trish and Lita main eventing Raw. They had that opportunity because of the brand split. That I think that only they had women's wrestling on Raw. I don't think they had women's. They had women's wrestling, but they didn't have a championship on SmackDown, I don't think, anyway. But in any event, that's what they spent the bulk of the final part of the show on, was talking about the new stars that were made. And basically showing that they had successfully did what they wanted to do, which is make new stars. So that was the episode. So this wasn't my favorite episode. It's not in my top. It's obviously in my top 5 because it's only been 5, but it's probably like 4 or 5 of the top 5. I would have liked it better if they'd have focused more on one particular character and not talked a lot about the business behind it. But it was still interesting, and I think there was a lot of stuff they left on the cutting room floor. Like, I would like to have found out why Paul Heyman was booted off of the writing team. They talked a lot about Eric Bischoff too. Eric Bischoff coming in. But I saw Eric Bischoff coming in kind of like they would bring in Goldberg or Scott Steiner when they brought him in. They brought him in on Raw. That to me was what they were doing. They were just bulking Raw up with more names and just kind of like throwing people on SmackDown like Hardcore Holly and Rhino and shit, right? So nobody who actually was going to do anything was going to end up really debuting on SmackDown. But it was really interesting. There was, I think, some stuff that were left out, like a lot of the politics about why Paul got removed, about the SmackDown making stars and Raw taking them. There was no mention of that. They didn't go into any detail about who was selling more tickets as far as who was, selling out arenas more. I'm pretty sure it was Raw, even though SmackDown's ratings were higher. I'm pretty sure Raw also was selling more pay-per-view buys, because if Raw got the first Elimination Chamber show. Oh no, that was not Raw. That was Survivor Series. Okay, so it was, I think the first single brand Elimination Chamber was the Raw Chamber. And then they also, well, yeah, I think so. I think every time they did Elimination, the first two Elimination Chamber were at combined events. Like, I think the first one was on Survivor Series, second was at SummerSlam, I think. I don't remember. But I guess this is the last episode of the season. I guess they're going to come back to talk about the Elimination Chamber and Money in the Bank and all that type of stuff. But this has been a really good series. So what did you think about it? Did you see the episode? If so, what did you think? Let me know in the comment section. Like this video, please. And leave a comment, please. And please, please, please share it. This channel needs to grow. And I'll talk to you guys later. Peace.